In this video, we'll take a look at getting started in ExpressPCB. I have opened a new document in ExpressPCB, and the first thing you should do generally is save your document. And I usually save mine in the same folder as my schematics. So you can see here, I saved my schematic file in my project wiring folder, and I'm going to save a PCB file of the similar naming, just so that I know that they are for the same design. So I've saved my file, and I want to show you some of the things to check out first. So here at the top, we can check our options. This changes our display unit and our grid spacing. And so you can check your board, but it should be a 1/10 inch grid spacing. So you can also choose to change your colors. For example, if you don't want to be working on a black background, you don't have to be. And so these are some options that you can modify. The other thing that you have to do before you really get started is link your schematic to PCB. So we've already made a schematic file. That is what gets linked to this PCB file to explain to the PCB what's connected, what gets 5 volts, what gets ground, what is connected to the other connections on our J1. So we're going to select our schematic and open it, and this confirms that we have linked. So that's kind of the setup steps. Now we'll use this similarly at first to how we used schematic. That is to say, we'll insert our standard components. As you come down the list, you can see a bunch of capacitors. You should know that axial is something where the cylinder of the component along that axis is where the wires come out. Radial, instead, you would look straight down on the cylinder and the wires are coming out this way. So we're going to choose a 1/10 inch spacing on a radial electrolytic capacitor. I choose this because I know it's polarized, and so I'll insert that into my PCB. I'm just going to put this over to the side for now, lined up to some pins, because I am going to, let me zoom in, I am going to want this to line up to pins because that's where I'll actually physically be putting it on the board. So with schematic, the geometry didn't matter. Here it does. And so actually, I think I forgot to suggest that you resize your board. You can change the limits of your board here, and you should take out a ruler or some calipers, or even just count pins. Figure out how big your board is. So you're going to want to adjust it so that it physically represents your circuit board. Okay, so we've inserted a capacitor. F is the short key for fitting this to the screen. So now I'm going to go find a connector. Lots of different connectors. It gives me a preview. And I'm going to try 8-pin. Here we go. This is a nice simple connector. It's 8 pins. The one that's different, that's square, is pin 1. And I'll insert that into my board. Now, you can choose to take your 8 wires and wire them to sequential pins on your circuit board. Or you could decide, I don't really have a connector, so I'm going to put pin 1 somewhere in the middle of the board and pin 2 somewhere else on the board. You could choose to have those wires not be wired in a line. So that's up to you and requires some planning. So now I'm just going to show you how this netlist works. We called our capacitor C1, so I type C1 into the part ID after double-clicking on it, and I click OK. We called our connector J1, so I click OK. Now, I come over here on the left, and I want to highlight net connections. And I click here on the capacitor. The capacitor takes 5 volts on its 5-volt pin and ground on its other pin. And we wired 5 volts here on the first pin of our connector and ground on pin 8. So as I insert components, I'll be able to see how they're wired, and then I can place my connector. And I'm actually going to first move my capacitor around here. I think I'll rotate it. Oops. So now I can place a trace either on the top layer or the bottom, so the top of the board or the bottom of the board. I think I'm going to choose the bottom of the board. And there we go. I've placed my first 2 traces. So I'll have to connect my capacitor between 5 volts and ground. And if I have properly created my schematic, I can see what all is connected to 5 volts as I work my way around my components. So that's this first introduction video. In the next one, I'll look at custom components.